Okay, everyone, and welcome to this AQA GCSE History Elizabeth, the first paper walkthrough. We're going to talk about the Elizabeth first paper. I'm going to look at the exam, and we're going to walk through how to tackle the questions 1, 2, 3, and 4. So question 1 on the Elizabeth paper is worth 8 marks, and this is a question where you will be given a historical source, usually written by a historian, and you'll be asked a question about how convincing the interpretation is. And the key for this question is to use your own knowledge to evaluate how convincing it is. So this question is, how convincing is interpretation A about the Earl of Essex? Explain your answer using interpretation A and your contextual knowledge. And you can see this is an article from Richard Cavendish, which appeared in History Today in the year 2001. So in terms of answering this question, you need to begin by reading the source really carefully. I would advise you to then underline the aspects of the source that tell you about the Earl of Essex and tell you about some of the key inferences you can make about the Earl of Essex. And the reason why I would encourage you to underline some of the key aspects of the source is that one of the key ways of doing well in this question is to make sure that you include actual quotes from the historical source. So you can see here as an example, I've picked out a couple of quotes. The idea that Essex soon charmed the elderly Queen, which suggests the Earl of Essex initially had a positive and close relationship with Elizabeth. And I've also picked out the quote, unwilling to be ruled by a woman. This suggests that the Earl of Essex challenged the authority of Elizabeth. So very much when you read the source for the first time, you need to think, right, what is the overall view of this interpretation A? And then, of course, you're going to test how convincing that is linked to your historical knowledge. So very much the overview of the historical source is that at first the Earl of Essex got on very well with the Queen, but as time progressed and some of the mistakes that the Earl of Essex made and some of the ways in which his character was quite impetuous and quite impatient, he offended the Queen, and obviously that led in the end to Essex's rebellion and his subsequent execution in 1601. So this just shows you the guide to the exam. You can see there's another type of question that you have, but if you just look at that, you're looking, if you want to get to the top level, level 4, a complex evaluation of the interpretation with a sustained judgment based on contextual knowledge and understanding. So you really need to be thinking all the way through your answer, how convincing is it? Is it quite somewhat convincing, partially convincing, very convincing? So that's how you do this question. There is absolutely no requirement within this question to write anything about provenance. It's all about using your own knowledge to say how convincing you think this interpretation is. So you very much need to think of the overall view of the interpretation, and as I said before, within this one, it's that idea that Essex begins when he first meets Elizabeth, he's close to her, but obviously towards the end their relationship sours and he ends up having his albeit failed rebellion. So here's an example answer. So what I would suggest that you do is that you have a couple of paragraphs where you're looking at specific aspects of the interpretation, but then it's very crucial that you are using well selected and precise and specific historical knowledge in order to evaluate how convincing the source is. Now just note that where I've highlighted in bold there, we're going to quote the question in our answer, and we are going to use judging phrases such as extremely or very, or we might say partially or quite convincing to show that. So if you just have a look at this answer, I'll just read it through with you. So it says, interpretation A is extremely convincing when it says that Essex, quote, soon charmed the elderly Queen. This is true as Essex, along with Robert Cecil, was part of a new group of younger Privy Councillors in the 1590s, with Essex being appointed to Privy Council in 1593 at the age of just 28. He was famous for his military heroics in the Netherlands and Spain, which is hinted as when it says he showed daring. However, this charm did not last long. He soon fell out with Elizabeth. So you're using very precise and specific knowledge there. Knowledge that he joined the Privy Council in 1593, knowledge of his military heroics, for example. But you're also including a quote from the interpretation, which is important. Furthermore, interpretation A is very convincing when it suggests he quickly fell out with Elizabeth, quote, unwilling to be ruled by a woman. Essex was frustrated about enemies at court, again another quote there, primarily Robert Cecil, who he felt were promoted above him when he became Secretary of State. The source is convincing, as I know that Essex turned his back on Elizabeth and almost drew his sword on her and was banished from court. This source is convincing when it says, quote, he failed in Ireland as he was sent to Ireland to redeem his reputation on a military campaign where he, against orders, made peace with the Irish rebels. It is correct, he did rebel, launching Essex Rebellion in February 1601 after a controversial staging of the play Richard II. The source omits to mention that Essex Rebellion quickly failed and he was subsequently executed, making the source less convincing. And then a quick conclusion. Overall, the source very convincingly portrays the changing fortunes of Essex in that it clearly shows how he was initially a favourite but very quickly fell out of favour and ended up being executed, probably due to his vain and jealous character. So that's the kind of answer that you are looking for. Very much taking quotes from the source, thinking about the overview of the interpretation, but using specific, well-selected and precise historical knowledge to evaluate just how convincing it is. Okay, so the question 2 asks you the question, what was important about something? So this question is very much about importance and significance. So in this question, it says, what was important about England's relationship with Spain? And it's worth 8 marks. And again, you can see to get that level 4 answer, you need a complex explanation of the consequences and the significance of this particular event. So chronology, I think, is really important both for questions 2 and 3. Because in order to establish whether something's significant, you need to think about the narrative of what's happening and what happened after. Okay. Obviously, this question, you need to have a very clear understanding about the overall relationship that England had with Spain throughout this time period. So using phrases within your answer such as this was important because, or this was significant because, are absolutely crucial to be successful in this question. So here's an example answer. Now you can see here that I have chosen to look at 2 aspects of England's relationship with Spain, and that's because in terms of the exam board requirement, they require you to look at least 2 things that are important about England's relationship with Spain. So I'm not going to read this whole answer to you this time, but you can have a look that the first paragraph very much talks about how at the beginning of Elizabeth's rule, England was actually fairly close to Spain, and obviously King Philip II had been married to Queen Mary I. But what I've looked at here is what's important about England's relationship with Spain is that once we have the arrival of Mary Queen of Scots in England in 1568, that very much changes England's relationship with Spain. And Spain's actually implicated and involved in some of the key plots, most notably the Ridolfi plot in 1571 and the Throckmorton plot in 1583, which caused the expulsion of the Spanish ambassadors to Spes and then later de Mendoza. And it just shows that Spain is undermining Elizabeth's rule. However, England's still not at war with Spain, but one of the key things that becomes significant in the 1570s and 1580s is the fact that when France and Spain stopped their conflict and they signed the Treaty of Joinville in 1584, that kind of frees up Spain to be more directly involved in trying to bring Catholicism back to England. So the second thing I chose to talk about was very much the descent into war. So then I've talked about what was significant in terms of Francis Drake's raid on the treasure ships, but also the Spanish involvement in the Netherlands and England's attempt to keep the Netherlands as a sort of stronghold for Protestantism in Europe, as the only place really of Protestantism in Europe as some of the main countries at that time, and how that led to open warfare, and of course evaluating the significance of things like the singeing of the King's Beard in 1587, which was Francis Drake's raid on Cadiz in April 1587, and of course the Spanish Armada in 1588, sorry. So therefore, we're very much looking at England's changing relationship with Spain and the fact that they went from a period of getting on quite well towards the start of Elizabeth's rule, the rejection of the marriage, the return of Mary Queen of Scots, and of course the Spanish Armada as well. So question 3 is write an account of how overseas exploration and new trade routes affected Elizabethan England. So this is very much a narrative approach. And again, they want you to really think about how things changed as a result, what were some of the consequences. So you very much need to be able to think about this in a clear narrative kind of structure. So your structure for this is important, and they require you to be able to write about at least 2 examples of how this brought about real change. So chronological understanding is really important for question 3. So again, you can pause this and read the example answer, but I've picked up on trade, so you need to know about trade. One of the things to be aware about trade during this time is that problems in the cloth industry, particularly when there is the war in the Netherlands, disrupts the cloth industry in Antwerp, which was one of the big cities in the Netherlands at the time. Obviously, Antwerp is now modern-day Belgium, but in those days, it was in the Netherlands. So England was very much looking for new trading routes. So just having that knowledge about the Eastland Company set up in 1579 for trade with Scandinavia, the Levant Company in 1581 for trade with the Mediterranean, and of course even the East India Company created in 1600 to trade into the Far East and India. The other thing that I've put it within this example answer is about the wealth that was brought to England through the piracy that took place. So people like John Hawkins and Francis Drake, we know that John Hawkins was an early slave trader as well, so that's worth mentioning. Francis Drake's circumnavigation of the world, which brought back huge amounts of money, actually brought back £140,000 from that voyage, which is about 200 million in today's money. And also the fact that overseas exploration brought this highly effective naval force, which enabled England to begin to increase its naval power abroad. A couple of example answers for that: the defeat of the Spanish Armada, of course, and also Walter Raleigh's attempts to set up a colony in Virginia in 1585. At Roanoke in 1587 at Chesapeake Bay. Although it failed, it paved the way for the idea to develop even more during the rule of James I. So you very much, for this question, really need to think about how did that overseas exploration, new trade routes, how did that affect England? So, very much talking about how we get increased trade, we get increased wealth, but we also get increased power of the English Navy during this time as well. Okay, and then finally, question number 10. The main reason why wealthy Elizabethans provided charitable care, such as almshouses, was due to their sense of duty towards the poorer classes. And this is all about using your study of Lord Burghley's almshouses to answer this question. So you can see there, again, to get the top mark, you need a complex explanation of the stated factor plus two other factors leading to a sustained judgment. So we've looked at this quite a lot in terms of the structure, and we know we're going to need to write about three factors plus a conclusion. So in many ways, they give you, well, they do actually, they just give you the first factor, don't they? So it's a little bit like an iceberg, this is that you know that idea about the sense of duty is going to have to be your first paragraph. Then you need to think about what your two other paragraphs are going to be. So I would probably go for religious reasons, and I would talk about the fact that wealthy Elizabethans provided charitable care to preserve their own legacy. I think that's particularly important when you're looking at Lord Burghley's almshouses. And then you need an overall conclusion. So all three of this answer, you need to be looking at some of these different key points. So you need to have evidence to include historical knowledge to support your argument. You need to have well-selected evidence, what I call killer facts. Avoid just describing everything that you know. You need to analyse the importance of each factor. You need to be able to link factors together. And overall, you need a judgment about which is the most important factor. So they're the key things to remember to do when you are completing this answer. So what I've put here, and you can pause this, have a look at it, but it's those example answers. So this one, there's no need for an introduction, but here are some example answers. So this is a paragraph about the sense of duty towards the poorer classes and some ideas that you could include for that. Very much about how wealthy people in Elizabethan times would have very much believed in the great chain of being, and it was the duty of wealthier people in society to help the poorest. You might even bring in some of the religious reasons in there as well. Lord Burghley himself, within Elizabeth's government, had been instrumental in things like the Book of Orders, which instructed JPs to make provision for the poor. And very much that sense of change, actually, in Elizabethan times, where people started to realise that there was this class of people that they called the deserving poor, that actually did need some help and some support. And certainly you can see in that Elizabethan legislation during that time, some of the local efforts in places like Norwich and Ipswich and York and also in the city of London, how there was that sort of dual approach to poverty. Definitely punishing beggars, the people that saw it, the sturdy or the idle beggars, but also helping out the poorest in society. And that, of course, eventually it will culminate in the 1601 Elizabethan Poor Law. So factor two you could talk about would be religious reasons. So you could talk about how, even though giving alms to the poor and help to the poor was very much seen as a sort of a Catholic practice, many Puritans took this up, and the fact that Lord Burghley himself was a Protestant with Puritan leanings, I think is a significant factor to be aware of as well. There's lots of evidence you can take from the actual almshouses themselves, the fact that residents are required to recite the Lord's Prayer and the Apostles' Creed, learn the Ten Commandments, go to church on Sundays and then Wednesdays and Fridays, as well as holy days, fines for those not attending church. That is really strong evidence to suggest that religion is an important reason why Lord Burghley built his almshouses. And then there's the lasting legacy. I think some of the key evidence for this is that actually Lord Burghley built the site in 1549, which might suggest that it was always his intention to build the almshouses. Perhaps the fact that his wife Mildred died in 1589 and she was well known for her charitable giving as well meant perhaps he wanted to honour her through that. But also all through the actual ordinances, he published his ordinances at the printers in London in the summer of 1595 so everyone could see them. So this wasn't something that Lord Burghley did quietly. He wanted everyone to know about this. The almshouses were off the main road. They're on the banks of the River Welland, so everybody could see them in the centre of Stamford. So that's all strong evidence that leaving a lasting legacy for the founder was a crucial factor. And then your last paragraph needs to be a conclusion where you give your overall opinion. I think within the conclusion, what I would say is that it's important to recognise that the sense of duty fact might have been a contributory factor, but also why it's maybe perhaps you're going to argue it's not the most crucial piece of evidence. And you could argue that is the most important. There's no right or wrong answer. But I think my own personal view would be that the idea of setting up a legacy and thinking about a founder's reputation was probably, in my view, looking at the evidence, the most important factor. But that's only what I think. And I think in your conclusion, you just need to think about what is your strongest piece of evidence for that. And for me, it's the fact he bought the site in 1549, which shows that he always intended to do this. So I hope you've enjoyed that and I hope you found that useful in terms of preparing you for the Elizabeth exam. And good luck and thank you for listening. Bye-bye.